all the support that everyone has brought to this event, is if we can come together and we can talk about a lot of the issues that are happening, a lot of the relationships that we have with our public servants, the relationship that we have with our police forces, and what can we do through education? What can we do through legislation? You know, what can we do through social activism?
I'm gonna take a shower and then we'll start the movie, okay?
Oh, that's great.
Please remember to have yourself muted at all times, please. Thank you.
That's nice. Okay. What can we do to truly make a change and a difference? So as I mentioned, you know, this is the first of many events between our two bar associations. And in fact, we have a relationship with the William H. Herbert Bar Association in Syracuse as well, and their president, Lanessa Owens, I think it might be Chaplin now, but we will make sure that the conversation remains and that the synergy and the energy that we have now to truly make that change does not die. So again, we appreciate you. And I do want to pass it back to Jamila to introduce our moderator, and we will move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. So I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Paula Johnson. She is a professor at law at Syracuse University College of Law. I did provide her biography to everyone prior to this meeting if you registered. I have to say I did not know Professor Johnson prior to this event. She was introduced to me by Christian Walker, a member of the Minority Bar Association, and I thank her so much for introducing us, because if you read her bio, she's pretty amazing, and she does work like this all the time, and she currently she co-founded and directs the Cold Case Justice Initiative at Syracuse University College of Law, where she investigates racially motivated murders committed during the civil rights era in contemporary times. And she teaches criminal law and a host of other accolades I can add to her name. So if you haven't read her bio, please do so and see the work that she's doing. She also will be sharing with us some events that she has upcoming in the near future, so we can share it with our membership and we can be a part of it. So at this point, I'm gonna turn it over to Professor Johnson, our moderator for the evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Jamila. Can everyone hear me well, clearly? Okay, looks good. Thank you for inviting me, first of all, to participate with you on this important discussion. I have to thank Christian Walker for recommending me to you. Christian is one of my most favored research assistants at the College of Law, and now she's a member of the Bar Association there. But I want to start, I think, by, first of all saying that I'm pleased that this conversation is happening. This is a part of several types of events like this that I've been participating in the Syracuse area and also nationally. So I'm really glad to be able to collaborate with you all this evening. As Jamila mentioned, and as you see on the bio description, my primary areas are criminal law and criminal procedure. And among my major classes and my work, my practice prior to going into teaching and continuing work looks at issues of race, intersectionality as it pertains to the criminal justice system. I teach criminal procedure. At Syracuse, we have the two criminal procedure classes. One is constitutional criminal procedure investigative. The other is constitutional criminal procedure adjudicative. And so the investigative class, primarily focuses on, Fourth Amendment search and seizure issues, as you could imagine. And why that becomes so important for our discussion today is because of these recent events that we've just been referencing. And that is, it's been a very hot summer. And I don't just mean the temperature. We have been in a great state of upheaval in the country because of a spate of incidents in which racism has been implicated in the interactions between citizens and law enforcement in the country. Perhaps most notably of late, the George Floyd situation, where he was killed with an officer's knee on his neck. There's also the Breonna Taylor case, the Ahmaud Arbery case, and and it's a long list, and it seems to be a growing list. So here we are. And when I talk about teaching constitutional criminal procedure investigative, I emphasize the constitutional aspect of that. And one of the things that pleases me about this program tonight is that so many of the panelists are from a cross-section of areas that have some role or responsibility as it relates to implementing criminal justice procedures. So I'd like to begin with this question, which I think is a fundamental question for all of the panelists who are here from your respective positions. And that is, what is your perception or your understanding of the role of law enforcement in a constitutional, representative, multicultural, diverse society such as the US? How would you define that in terms of what is the role of law enforcement in our society?
I'll be happy to start.
Begin? Should I call on people to begin?
I'll be happy to start, Professor. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, this is District Attorney John Flynn here in Buffalo, and
Okay.
and again, thank you for your question and thank you for inviting me here. I believe that law enforcement has a paramount role in ensuring the constitutional values and the equity values that we as citizens need to operate under. I personally believe that there is no greater aspect in society than the public safety. I think personally, as you can tell by my bio, maybe I've spent the majority of my adult life in the military, and I've spent a lot of my adult life in the criminal justice system as an ADA, as a judge, and now as a district attorney. So I believe strongly that public safety is paramount, if not number one. And when it comes to public safety of our citizens domestically, there is no one more important than our local law enforcement. So the role of law enforcement to ensure the constitutional values and to ensure that people are treated equally and fairly, I don't think that you can overstate it enough, Professor.
Okay. Thank you, DA Flynn. Who would like to go next?
If I may, I'm sorry, John Elmore.
Yes.
Just a little bit about my background. I'm a former New York State Trooper. As a matter of fact, in 1984, I was the first African-American state trooper ever assigned to Onondaga County in Syracuse. I got a scholarship to Syracuse, resigned. I spent time in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the New York State Attorney General's Office, and I have been in private practice for quite a long time, longer than I like to say. But the thing I'd like to say about the role of police in society is that at 5 o'clock, the police are the government, right? Anybody that has a problem, it could be somebody that has a heart attack, a cat in the tree, an argument with the neighbors, an auto accident, whatever the case, a fire, whatever the case may be, the police are our government after 5 o'clock. And the way people's perception of government is a lot of the ways that the police departments treat civilians in places where police departments are have a standard where they're more community service oriented versus a military police. I think people are happier. They feel good about the police, and the way that people feel about the police has a lot to do with their happiness, their security, and the way that they feel about government.
Okay. Thank you very much. Who's next on our panel?
I spoke up a bit. Caroline Wojtaszek, I'm the Niagara County District Attorney. I would just reiterate what John Flynn said, and of course, John Elmore. At its basic level, I think people look to law enforcement to fairly enforce the laws of New York State. They appreciate, I think our community appreciates that we have laws that need to be followed to keep our community safe. But I think the big factor there, and I think where, as you said, we're having a hot summer, is the fair enforcement of those laws on everyone in the community. I know that, there's people in the community that appreciate that we need law enforcement to keep us safe, but I don't think anyone is willing to have law enforcement at the expense of other people's constitutional and states' rights.
Okay. Thank you. Is there someone next?
Can I jump in?
Yes.
I think we have two police forces in this country. And I think that you asked the question, what should the role of police officers be? If you look at how police handle situations in the suburbs, for example, in affluent white neighborhoods, how they handle domestic disputes, how they handle little nuisance things that children do, and all those things. It seems to be a difference between that and what happens in the Black community. You can't tell me there's any way in the world that let's say take one of Rochester suburbs, Penfield, that a police officer would keep his knee on a white person's neck for 9 minutes. So there's really a question of, yes, the police are there to protect and defend and all those things, but the fact is, in the Black community, they've had a different role, and they've acted differently too often toward Black people and brown people. And so their perception of the people have of the police is not that they're here to help, but they're actually, when we see them, they're going to beat us up. They're going to find some reason to arrest me. If I say anything they don't like, they're going to accuse me of disorderly conduct or any custodial interference, and those other things that they use to keep people in line. And so I think the reality of it is that the police have not been, and too often in the Black community, have not been what they're supposed to be and what they are in other communities. That they can count on the police to actually be there to help them, and we don't look at it that way when we see them. A lot of times, even when we call them, we have a negative interaction with them. So there's a difference, and it seems to me that the problem is that the police are not the same across the board.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have other panelists.
I'll kind of jump in here.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I've been a police chief in Rochester for about a year and a couple months. And certainly when you talk about, I think, the role of law enforcement, one, I think, what our mission is one, to reduce crime. And I think what you have to do is you have to balance that. There has to be a balancing public safety versus not trying to over-police. There is a tough balance there. And then also the second part of it, I think, has been touched on, protecting and serving. And then the third part for our mission in our department is upholding the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of New York. And there's just so much within the third point that I've mentioned. But the biggest point there, I think, what I think we're talking about is making sure that, you know, we are able to balance public safety versus over policing, particularly in Black and brown communities.
May I
Thank
speak,
you.
please? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Deputy Commissioner Lark from Buffalo Police Department, and not to be redundant, but I would like to just speak on that, and very similar to what the Chief of Rochester said. Our role as far as law enforcement in the city of Buffalo is to obviously protect and to serve and to reduce the amount of crime that we have in our cities or across the country, nation, so to speak, and to do so fairly and justly. And I do realize that a lot of people don't believe that that's always happening, and sometimes it's not, but that is our primary role. And we look to do that and to balance it out and to do it fairly and to find different ways to do it where it's more effective. Back in the day, police were considered the warriors, and right now we're trying to take on a different role and be more of a guardian so that we can build relationships with the community and have more of a positive effect. But it is primarily to juggle a lot of things and mainly to protect and serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Did we get everyone who's on the panel? I know Mr. Howard is not here yet. Okay, so I think that that's everyone. And thank you all for your responses. You know, I wanted to begin with that because I think it is, I think it's fundamental how one envisions the role as to how they carry out the role. And, you know, a number of you have talked about public safety, surely public safety. But in equal measure, we've been talking about some disparities in the way in which these functions are carried out in different communities. And that, you know, surely accounts for what we have seen in terms of people taking to the streets this summer in outrage over what happened, not just to Mr. Floyd, but to others, including in your own communities. And from what I understand, this is not just anecdotal. I have been reading reports, for instance, that show the disparities or disparate treatment of Black and brown people in their interactions with the police. In a number of cases, they are quite, or certainly begin as quite minor incidents or offenses, and they can result, if not in death, in serious injury. And so, you know, to the extent that we're that we are acknowledging, and I guess I would want to say I take that as a given, that we are acknowledging that these disparities exist from your own vantage points, right? From your respective roles. We have chiefs of police, we have legislators, we have district attorneys who are here this evening. If we acknowledge that that is a reality in our society and in your own communities, in your respective roles, what do you think is necessary in order to eradicate the types of problems that we've been seeing, where you're saying that people should be treated equally, irrespective of race and any other factors? What within your unique roles and responsibilities can you do and see yourselves doing to address these issues?
Well, you have to change things, Professor. You have to alleviate the discrepancies. Take marijuana, for example. All right, I've been a season ticket holder for the Buffalo Bills now for my dad's had season tickets since 1960, since day one, and My dad passed away a number of years ago. So I've been going to every Bills game now for over 20 years, okay? And I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of individuals at Buffalo Bills games are Caucasian. And there is a lot of marijuana smoking in the parking lot at Buffalo Bills games and in other areas around the stadium, okay? You don't see all the white people getting arrested for marijuana possession at Buffalo Bills games. It's not happening, Professor, all right? And what you see in other areas, mainly in inner city neighborhoods, okay, you see a disproportionate number of people of color who are in the criminal justice system for low-level marijuana offenses. Now, the way to change that is you fix the problem, okay? And I believe that the New York State Legislature, took steps toward doing that when they basically, decriminalized last year, low-level possession of marijuana. I have consistently, in my 3+ years now as DA, not prosecuted those kind of cases. I have even gone so far as to go back in the annals of our courts where there were outstanding warrants for individuals who were arrested on low-level marijuana offenses, and I've dismissed those old warrants, in court. So it's great to recognize a problem, okay, but when after you recognize a problem, you got to do something about it, I believe, and I think to a certain extent we have when it comes to low-level marijuana possession. And again, I think that change is going to have a positive impact on equality issues in our community.
So thank you for that, and let me pick up on your response, DA Flynn. Yeah. And I want to ask, and I hope I don't botch your name. Caroline
Wojtaszek.
Wojtaszek. Thank you.
You can just go with Caroline. It is so much easier.
Well, I will try. But as the 2 district attorneys on the panel, I want to ask you about your particular roles in ensuring that that law enforcement doesn't abuse their power. So, for instance, the example of low-level, marijuana use has been decriminalized in the state, but using that example or other examples of sort of low-level offenses, and then there are things that might even be considered to be more serious types of offenses. But in any of those instances, how do you ensure that law enforcement doesn't abuse their authority in any of those instances in their response, in their interactions with members of the public, with the accused, those who might be accused of offenses? What do you do to ensure that that doesn't happen?
Well, I think if I may jump in, I think it is really important to have leaders like district attorneys, administrators, decision makers within law enforcement, within my office, that will call out unfair treatment, that will not rally around to protect those who over-police, those that treat people in our community unfairly. I think, that sort of does come from the top. If there's a sense that people or people in the district attorney's office or anyone will see something or hear something from a community member and rally around to protect law enforcement or even protect decisions in my own office by other assistant DAs, it's really important to know that the person at the top will not do that and will not tolerate that sort of behavior or treatment, and will call it out and prosecute it if necessary. And I know, John, we've talked about this before. It is, it's not it's not a fun role to be there and have to prosecute law enforcement. I know John's done it. I've been called on to do it. And it's important to do the right thing no matter who is accused of the wrongdoing. And if it's law enforcement and they see, your willingness to call out that behavior, that's what starts to change, the culture within law enforcement. And I think, there was a lot of trepidation with body cam and police having to have body cam. I personally like body cam because I think it allows us, a view into things and into interactions that we were not privy to before, and we just relied on people's word. And now I think, we've certainly trained our law enforcement that, if you don't have it on, the community is going to perceive that you're doing something wrong when that wasn't on, and you weren't treating someone fairly when that wasn't turned on. And so, I think it promotes better behavior, and it also promotes training opportunities, and I think, so I think it's such a heavy question, but I think if you have people at the top of these organizations that won't tolerate it, I think that is a really important part of this. I think it's important to encourage more diversity up in those leadership, administrative, and decision-making positions so that you can change the culture and get different perspectives that maybe weren't considered before. And my other important role that I see in trying to change kind of the dynamic of what goes on in our community is the idea that you meet those that we've chosen in our community to speak for members of the community, our faith leaders, our elected officials. Meet those people and learn more about each other and come to the table from a position of trust, instead of, when difficult decisions or difficult issues arise. When you come from a place of trust, instead of just coming to the table, for the first time to try to deal with those challenges, you're in a much better position. And that's certainly what I've found in Niagara County. When we had people rightfully take to the streets here in Niagara Falls, we had done a lot of work beforehand, building relationships, and we really relied on those relationships leading in to those to those protests, and they certainly served us well to have peaceful interactions.
I would say on that subject, I think that, well, let me start with that. What I perceive from the standpoint of the criminal justice system itself, in terms of the DAs and the system. Oftentimes, police use prosecuting people who they actually abuse. They charge them with something so they can get away with it. So now, I'm putting this guy in jail because he's disorderly conduct, or he interfered with police, whatever those little charges they come up with. To get someone now on the defensive now, instead of being able to actually go on the offense and say, look, this guy abused me. And it seems too often prosecutors have gone along with that. And we're seeing some changes now, but too often prosecutors have gone along with that and have helped use that system. You also see, like an example of the Christopher Pate case here in Rochester, in which I think I know the mayor and the police chief fired the officer who was responsible for abusing him. The district attorney, if I had done what he did to that young man, I would have gotten charged with a felony. She reduced his charges, and so the public has to know that if the police commit a crime, that they will be treated just like an ordinary citizen will be treated. In fact, even more so, I think, because we give them more responsibility and more authority and put a gun in their hands, and that we don't always see that. I think as a legislator, I think the city, at least here, the city of Rochester, the city council passed the Police Accountability Board. Last year in Monroe County, the Republicans tried to pass a law, they call it an anti-harassment law. Basically, if you said something the police didn't like, essentially, annoyed them, you could be put in jail. And so we had to fight to get that law overturned. So it is a fight. I think the other thing is, the last thing I want to say is the disparity between the budgets for the district attorneys and the public defenders. Here in Monroe County, the district attorney, his budget is twice the amount of the public defender's budget. And so what you have is, because of the lack of attorneys, because of the lack of resources, a lot of times our defendants are pushed into taking plea deals because they don't really have lawyers who have the time to actually handle their cases, don't have the resources to go out and get investigators and other things that the district attorney has. And so now, for low-level offenses, a lot of times people may not even be guilty of, or would get a different kind of result. Now they're forced to take pleas and get records because their attorney does not have the means to really represent them the way they need to be represented. So that's something we're looking at now and seeing how we can do something to try to equalize, even if not 100%, try to equalize that disparity, because there's almost no way that a poor defendant has a chance.
So I hear all of the responses that we've gotten so far, and I guess I would add to some of this discussion that there are several ways in which the question of accountability for members of law enforcement can become questionable. One is, and I think it was John Elmore who said about the police or the government after 5 o'clock. And I take from that that there is a point in time when no one really sees what is happening except for the encounter between the police and that individual or group of individuals. And so when the time arises for someone to be arrested, that matter comes to the district attorney. And if there's any question about that, it becomes a matter of professional ethics and as well as law as to whether or not everything that comes to the district attorney's office is going to be accepted at face value, so that our charges, our cases not pursued, are they dropped when that matter comes? Is it minor in a way that it will be dropped? And that's just in terms of handling particular types of cases. There seems to be some dissonance as I've been reading and researching this matter between the fact of decriminalization of marijuana and the continued arrest for its use, which is disproportionately in Black and brown communities. And I think that is something that certainly has to be addressed. The other question, though, seems to be about whether or not there is also a dissonance between the trust between the community that was mentioned and actually holding members of law enforcement accountable for egregious actions taken, say excessive force or other types of actions on their parts. I'm reminded, for instance, that in the George Floyd death, that the local prosecutor did not handle that case. In fact, that Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, is handling the prosecution of the officers. And so it suggests that sometimes local law enforcement may not indeed enforce matters when they are in their own communities. And so, that might have something to do with the lack of trust between the community and members of law enforcement, whether it's the district attorney's office or the police themselves. And in talking about the need to bridge that gap and begin to make sure that every person is treated equally without the specter and the reality of deadly force, how will you ensure that the public is aware of that, as well as those who come in direct contact with the police?
Could I start on that? And thank
Sure.
you. Just to go back to the previous question, first of all, what can we as lawyers do
Mm.
to make the system better? I think we all need to participate, and we all have an obligation to educate the public. We need to participate in voting. In Erie County, we had a district attorney before John Flynn became the district attorney that hired very, very few African-American assistant district attorneys. The African-American lawyers in Buffalo got behind John Flynn against some of the powers to be and got the clergy involved. The community looked at us as lawyers as to know who would be most fit for that job. And he was able to win the Erie County District Attorney's Office with over 85% of the African-American can vote. So we can get involved politically. We can get involved by educating the public through public speaking, through radio shows. If you look at some of the legislation that has made the criminal justice reform, such as if you look at some of the people that have been wrongfully convicted because of confessions that were false, misidentifications that were false, and look at some of the advocacy of the bar associations, the National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys, New York State Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys. Now all confessions, in order to be admitted at trial, have to be videotaped or audio taped. When it comes to identification procedures now, in the old school way, the photographs were never shown to a jury, but there's been legislation now that says that they are. There's been legislation that has been pushed by bar associations and lawyers that now require police officers to wear body cams. So, when we can educate the people, mobilize people to vote, bring the district attorney's office to our community, we can get change. Now, when it comes to regulating bad police officers and changing their conduct, one of the recent things that just happened was the governor signed an executive order that says that police personnel files now are no longer private. Okay, so how is that going to affect the DA's office? Well, you know what? If there's a police officer, that has 20 or 30 complaints that have been founded, but he has not been determined, he hasn't been terminated, the district attorney is going to look at that police officer and say, you're not credible. Or the defense attorneys are going to realize that this is a bad cop, and we're taking every one of his cases to trial and get those charges dismissed. So there's just a lot of advocacy that's happened. And I think that when it comes to prosecuting police officers, there is an inherent contradiction or inherent conflict for the local district attorney to be prosecuting police officers. We, as in bar associations, Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, the Minority Bar Association, we need to advocate for the Attorney General to not only prosecute police officers that are involved in a death or a shooting, but all cases of police misconduct. Because how can the DA prosecute a police officer on one hand, but he needs that same police officer to be a witness on 20 or 30 other cases? It's very difficult for them to do that. They have to make a decision. Do I drop these 5 or 10 gun cases because now I can't have this same police officer that I'm prosecuting for, slapping somebody around, or, how do I juggle it? But if we have the Attorney General's office or a regular police prosecution unit with statewide jurisdiction, that can take away that conflict and give the public more confidence.
Amen to that.
I was just.
I am all for that, Professor Johnson. I mean, you talk about trust, Professor Johnson. You would immediately. I mean, in addition to the logistical problems that Attorney Elmore mentioned there, as far as the problems that I face just logistically with having officers as my witnesses, who on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I'm prosecuting them. Okay, put those aside. Okay, just look at it from a trust standpoint. All right, the community is going to have so much more trust if an outside entity is coming in and looking at the officer's misconduct here, and an outside entity is going to be the ones who are going to make the decision on whether or not that officer is getting prosecuted or not. I mean, you know, to me, in addition to the logistical problems, trust is a huge factor in this.
Thank you, DA Flynn. Now, let me ask you a particular question, because I understand that the mayor has issued an executive order that directs the police not to use the smell of marijuana as the justification for a search. Are you going to instruct your ADAs not to prosecute cases where the smell of marijuana is the basis for a vehicle search?
No. So I mean, you've heard the progressive side of me. Now I'll switch hats, okay, and talk on the other side of my mouth here.
Does that executive order not exist?
Well, no, the executive order exists, okay, but it flies in the face of the Fourth Amendment, the Constitution, okay. It's still constitutionally allowed, okay, that marijuana, the smell of marijuana, is justifiable for officers to make a search, okay, and so I listen here, if the officers don't do it, okay, because they're following the mayor's directive, that's fine, okay, but I can't tell you how many serious cases that I have here in my county where officers find guns, they find fentanyl, much harder drugs in these searches, okay? And so as long as the United States Supreme Court continues to allow marijuana searches, a search to be based on the smell of marijuana, then I'm going to follow that, Professor.
Isn't that a contradiction, though, if the state has decriminalized it? I mean,
no, because the person's driving.
Exactly.
Yeah, they haven't decriminalized an individual driving while on the influence of marijuana.
So you're saying it's just individual driving. Suppose it's not the driver, it's someone in the back seat.
How do we know that, though?
Yeah.
How do we know that? Yeah, we don't know.
What if it's the same officers day after day, car after car, time after time, same neighborhood, same people, stopping cars and saying they smell marijuana, no matter how it's found? It could be wrapped in a package in a trunk, but they smell it when they stop.
Now that is a different question now, okay? If I have any indication that the officer is lying to me, okay, that the officer is being untruthful in their search, okay, then obviously that's a different scenario, and that's going to be looked at much more closely. No doubt about that, Emily.
Excuse me, everyone. Just a reminder about protocol. Please, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat section and I will submit them to Professor Johnson, who has been asking the questions that are appearing in the chat section. And also we do have Legislator Johnson on the call right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again for that. And so it would seem that the question is whether or not there is a disparity in terms of how this matter of smelling marijuana might arise to justify a vehicle search. And perhaps that is one of those areas where candor and trust will be revealed in the way in which law enforcement members as well as the district attorneys handle this. So that is something, it seems to me, needs to be further addressed. I would like to go back to something that we were talking about a moment ago, and that is the records of police officers who are found to have transgressed whatever types of rules. Maybe they've used excessive force, or otherwise found to have abused their authority. And so New York State has just recently issued a policy that will make those records available. But beyond that, I have found it, somewhat astounding that there is not a national database that includes information about police officers or departments, for that matter, who have been, found to violate people's rights. And there has been a call for national legislation for there to be such a database. And I want to ask the police, chiefs in particular, what is your view about having this kind of transparency with respect to officers that might have committed some sort of, violation or abuse of authority, excessive force, and the like?
I'll jump in here. Well, I mean, I think with the new law, 58 being repealed, I think anything that is going to lend itself to transparency, I think is a good thing. When City of Rochester created the Police Accountability Board, this was the talks first began. One of the things that I said was that I think what people want to know when they file complaints is what happened to the officer. Based on 50A, that information was not able to be released. If you go to states like down south, the police chief can say, I gave the officer 10 days, I gave the officer 20 days. Right now, I can say I terminated an officer. The officer is no longer working for the Rochester Police Department. But outside of that, I wasn't able to release that. So there's some anonymity there that obviously created a lack of trust, legitimacy, when you talk about releasing personnel files or results of an internal affairs investigation. So, I mean, I also think that there's a lot of conversation right now with respect to what can and what cannot be released. And I hear there's going to be some lawsuits that are going to be filed with respect to this. I know there are a bunch of unions across the board, across the state, that are asking for clarification with respect to such. So there's talk about a lawsuit being filed, an injunction possibly being filed by the courts, for the courts to say, we need some clarity on this, as one, the vagueness of it, as to what can be released and what cannot be released. So I think that's where a lot of issues, and as I talked to some of my colleagues around the state with regard to releasing that information. I mean, for me, transparency, I'm all for transparency, but I think we also need to look at some of the things that, as long as there's a road or avenue to look at and see if there are any unintended consequences as a result of such. But I do believe that the courts are going to have to clarify the legislative intent of the repeal of 50A.
If I may jump in, please. Yes, we have a similar situation here in Buffalo. We've had many discussions about the timeliness of releasing the disciplinary cards. We are in favor of the transparency. We realize that it's absolutely necessary to even begin to build or rebuild some trust with the community. So we're talking about, again, more direction, more clarification, what can be released, when it can be released, the timeframes, and so forth. And to increase our personnel in order to be able to deal with the demands of this. They tell you that you have to do it. It's just like the bail reform and so forth, but they don't give you any funding for it and so forth. So we are going to have to increase our personnel in order to be able to meet these demands. Thank you.
I am not sure if we did we have a glitch there?
It's cleared up.
Okay, all right, thanks for that.
Professor, could I say one thing?
Certainly.
Just really quick.
Yeah.
You know, I think that we're going to really accomplish a lot if we take away our labels, okay? Some people label themselves as conservatives. Some people label themselves as liberal, pro-police, anti-police, racist, anti-racist, prosecutors, criminal defense attorneys. And I think if we're going to get any solutions, you know, people, when they label themselves, they tend to delete and filter out information that doesn't agree with their preconceived notions. So what I just ask everybody to do is to just forget about any labels so that we can have an open and honest discussion and really just try to be practical and objective, realize that there are problems, and come up with some solutions and plans of actions.
Okay, well, let's see how let's see how we go with that. I guess I would suggest that labeling per se is not an impediment to reaching solutions, but a willingness to be open-minded to others' perspectives and experiences. You know, I think that people are, you know, will want to have, you know, the opportunity for self-definition. And if that includes labeling, then so be it. But I think that one cannot be so glued to a particular position, you know, that they can't, you know, hear something else. And I think that that's why we're trying to have this discussion across the board. Let me say this though, and this has been brought to my attention, and it's actually a question that I had as well. And that is, you know, I don't see anyone on the panel who is, you know, expressly or explicitly listed as a community activist who is working on issues with respect to, you know, policing, law enforcement, and community issues. And in that vein, the question that I had is, how do you perceive the role of, you know, the activist community? You know, Black Lives Matter is one example, but, you know, there are others as well who have been, you know, very determined in making sure that there is accountability in these areas. The role, for instance, of civilian police review boards, and how do you all see those operating in your communities?
If I may, just Caroline, we have, you know, a few years ago, the Peacemakers, just a community group that started in the city of Niagara Falls, kind of came up within our community, and there was an initial kind of reluctance from local law enforcement. You know, why are they here? You know, what's their role? Are they here just to watch what we're doing? And I'll tell you, in my 3.5 years here, I have seen that completely go a 360 in a good way. That organization has grown. That organization has become kind of almost like, in some sense, a mediator between, you know, the community and law enforcement. And it has proven very, very effective. So much so that, like I said, you know, we have the organization formalized in the city of Niagara Falls. And when we were having, you know, protests in Lockport as well, and kind of community meetings in Lockport, you know, I personally reached out to some of the heads of our Peacemakers to say, hey, we don't have this in Lockport. You know, not only would I like to see it started in Lockport, but is there any way you could come to these meetings and these protests and kind of serve the role that I've seen you very successfully serve in the city of Niagara Falls? And it has worked out beautifully. I think law enforcement is starting to see and embrace that concept of not only kind of being called out on things that the community is concerned about, but actually feeling that they should answer to the Peacemakers, so that you know, we can start building that trust with the community. So as far as that organization has been concerned in our community, which is much smaller than Buffalo, it has been, to me, if you say call it Peacemakers, I've considered it a lifesaver here in kind of building that community trust.
I think the activists are very important because they keep us from getting too comfortable. You know, they're willing to go play, like as an elected official, there are things that I probably should not say, even if I think them. And so they have a certain level of freedom that I think elected officials don't have, and even the prosecutors and police don't have, to say things. Even when we agree with them, they really force us to think. And because they're not tied to anything other than the mission and the cause that they have. Now, I certainly don't agree with everything they've said, but I mean, obviously the issue of Black Lives Matter is an important issue because we've seen across the country that there seems to be a disregard of Black life when it comes to law enforcement. And you see time and time again. I mean, you go from Eric Garner back in 2015, 2016 to George Floyd this year. And you would never think that would happen again. And it did. So I think the activists are very important because they're keeping us on our toes and making sure that we don't get comfortable and think that we've arrived somewhere that we haven't.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to ask this question to each of you as well, and that is, you know, frequently as these discussions have begun to happen, or certainly begun to happen more intensely across the country, you know, people will sometimes describe the issue or the problem as being quote unquote bad apples on the police force. It's, you know, as isolated incidents or, you know, aberrations, as opposed to something more systemic, systemic racism, systemic issues with regard to race and poverty and other social circumstances. And I wonder, for our panelists, how do you view the kinds of discrepancies, disparities in treatment that we're talking about? Do you see this as a matter of individual bad apples on a particular force, or do you see this as something more systemic that transcends even geography as it relates to law enforcement and relations with the community?
Could I tackle that one, please? There's something known as a blue wall of silence. And there is something that happens when a police officer testifies against another police officer. They get ostracized by their brother police officers. They get threatened where they may need a call or need assistance, where their brother or sister police officers will be slow to respond. Police officers work strange hours. They work midnights, they work weekends. They're working when no one else is working, so they socialize with each other. You know, who can have a beer at 7 or 8 in the morning after a midnight shift, but them and their fellow officers. So they're very, very close. And so you have the bad officers, but you have the good officers that are afraid to intervene, and they watch what's going on. They have a blind eye to it, and they just keep going. They're afraid to testify against other police officers. They're afraid that the police unions will not back them up, and they're afraid even that they're going to be denied promotions because of the fact that they told on other police officers. I mean, I could just tell you, I was only a state trooper for a couple of years, and I saw how that blue wall of silence works. Okay, I can remember graduating from the police academy and learning how the things to do the right way, and then sitting with a senior officer saying, you know, you never ever want to tell against another police officer, because how can we trust you in a life and death situation, you know, if we think that you're going to tell on something, tell on us if we bend the rules or break the rules. You know, when we go to court, everybody's testimony's got to be the same. Our reports got to be the same. You never, ever tell or squeal on a brother officer. And it was indoctrinated in us in the community. I mean, in the academy, you know, I lived in an academy for 6 months. And I can remember the academy that I went to in 1979 was the first police academy where it was diversified. There were 35 African-American state troopers in the state of New York. My class doubled that. My class doubled in the amount of women. And I can remember a woman in my class being sexually harassed. She told on the people that were harassing her. And right away, you know, the counselors, you know, labeled this person as Sweaty Betty. You know, her uniform started disappearing. People didn't want to talk to her, share rides home. And that's indoctrinated in the police academies. And unless there is state legislation that's enforced, that says that a police officer has a duty to intervene when there's misconduct, or somebody's being assaulted, and unless there's criminal liability and civil liability, we're never, ever going to break that wall of silence.
I believe that was part of, that was one of the laws they passed along with the 50A repeal, was that a police officer has a duty to intervene. I believe that.
But one thing, legislator, I'm talking about criminal penalties, okay? Just like on Section 20 in the penal law, you commit a robbery, you're the getaway driver, the guy during the robbery commits a murder, you could be charged with murder. So I'm talking about a duty to intervene, not just disciplinary, but with criminal sanctions as well.
But you know, I think ultimately, not. I'll defer to the police chiefs on this one, but I believe ultimately, the easiest way and the best way for this to end policeman misconduct is for the police departments and the police officers to clean up their own ranks. I would think if I was an officer, I do not want to be associated with bad cops. I don't want people to look at me and think because this guy over here is a jerk that I'm a jerk. And so it would seem to me that they would have it would be in the interest of the officers who want to force themselves to say, look, we don't want this kind of officers around us because they taint me and the public perception of me. And I don't understand why there's not more of a push within the police unions themselves to do that. You know.
If I may just jump in as well, you know, the issue of, you know, you talk about the blue wall of silence, which I certainly am not going to deny, and you lived it. So what I will say too, and I'm sure I would think that, you know, our law enforcement on the panel would agree. I mean, one of the other frustrations that I've certainly heard from our police chiefs here is when you do get a police officer that has violated the rules and been written up, it is extremely hard to get them off the force. It is extremely hard through the union protections to really do something effective to that officer in a way that's going to keep them away from the public. So I don't know if the other law enforcement on the panel would agree with that, but I've certainly heard, you know, how we've, you know, chiefs say we have, you know, officers on our force and we can't get rid of them even if we wanted to, even if we, you know, try to push it to the limit. So that's a frustration I've certainly heard here locally.
Can I say one other thing too? And maybe the police chiefs could address this. But even African-American police officers are afraid and reluctant to talk about racism within their own ranks because when they're afraid to get labeled racially sensitive. And when they get labeled racially sensitive, it affects their abilities to get promoted. And I've had a lot of friends that are City of Buffalo police officers, state troopers, that'll tell me, hey, you know what, we when we hear racial slurs, when, you know, and things like that, we just keep our mouths shut because, you know, we got a job, we're earning $100,000 a year. And if we get that tag being a racially sensitive police officer, we're going nowhere.
So why don't we ask the law enforcement members if you could address this most recent conversation that we've been having. We've been describing it as the blue wall of silence, but you know, in essence, you know, this is a disincentive for officers who would want to report doing within their ranks, but for various institutionalized or cultural, meaning police, law enforcement cultural reasons, would be reluctant or loath to do so. What is your perspective on those things and how they might be addressed and improved?
I'll comment. Do I believe racism exists in the Buffalo Police Department? I'm sure it does, just like it exists in every other profession. However, I believe—
I'm sorry to interrupt you. So that's responding to the earlier point about whether we're just talking about bad apples or whether we're talking about something more systemic.
I believe it's both. I believe it can be systemic, and I believe that you do have some officers who repeatedly have the same issues, whether it's conduct or whether it's a large number of excessive use of force. So sometimes we see the same people the same officers over and over again. You spoke about disciplinary issues that the police commissioner has when it comes down to disciplining an officer. There's a process. So if the commissioner decided to suspend or charge an officer, then it has to go through a disciplinary procedure. The only time that our commissioner can fire a police officer is under the 18 months probationary period. Other than that, if you saw something that was very offensive on a video or something like that, and I hear a lot of times the community will say, oh, that officer should be fired. Well, it's not that simple. You can't just fire an officer. If he does, the officer goes through the process, the arbitration, and may get his job back, and then his or her job back, and then is awarded back pay. So it has to go through the process. Some laws would have to change in order to give the commissioner the ability to terminate. He can suspend without pay, only up to a certain number of days. So again, limited as to what can be done. And yes, the union does, I believe, oftentimes go to bat for officers who they know are clearly wrong. Of course, we need police unions, and they've done a lot of good for officers. And I deal with the union on a regular basis with contract and personnel matters. That's a large part of what I do. I do believe that they have a responsibility as well as to, just like parenting. When you see your child constantly do something wrong, you're an irresponsible parent if you don't correct that behavior. Unions don't do that. They go to bat for officers who are clearly wrong, which I think further perpetuates the problem. So yes, we have a lot of work to do. And with respect to this blue wall, I don't know, I've never seen as much diversity in the Buffalo Police Department as we have right now. We have a tremendous number of minority lieutenants, supervisors, first line supervisors, female supervisors. You have African-American police commissioner, you have an African-American deputy police commissioner. So I sat on an interview panel when it comes down to promotions and so forth. I think people feel comfortable, maybe not all, but I do think that there is a voice that they can exercise if they feel these things. Officers have another avenue. They can show up on calls if they feel that some of their colleagues are doing things that they don't feel are right. They can show up on a call, and just the mere presence of officers there can and will curtail, because I've done it when I was on patrol. So there's ways that officers can and do every day, I believe, do their part to try to curtail if they see bad behavior, if they know certain things are happening. We have our ways of doing what we feel we need to do. So it does happen. They do speak up, even if it's not verbally running and telling somebody, they do it in other ways. So it does happen.
So is it your suggestion or position that with this increased diversity in the Buffalo Police Department, that the kind of skewed numbers that we're seeing will dissipate as a result of that? Is there some evidence, some empirical evidence that things have changed as a result of the changing composition of the police department?
I think the diversity definitely helps. It helps to have people that look like you working in certain neighborhoods where where predominantly Black people live, Black and brown people. It helps to have supervisors. It helps to have officers that are used to working with certain classes, different types of demographics. So you have less issues. People don't necessarily have the fear, they can relate. So we've decided to do something with our recruits when they come out of the academy. They go to the Erie County Academy, and all of the surrounding police agencies train their officers together. And we normally will get them for a couple of weeks after they come back to Buffalo after graduating. We're gonna actually do some things to try to immerse them in certain communities so that they are familiar with the areas, that they do strictly community services before they go out and do patrol. You know, if there's officers who are not used to working in certain communities, and we know that that's a fact, then we have an obligation to try to do some things to break down some barriers before they do patrol. Now, our class that we have an academy class in currently, and because of COVID, they weren't able to attend the academy. They did a tremendous amount of community policing at the Broadway Market, at the parks and so forth throughout this pandemic. So they have had probably more community policing than any other recruit class. That's how we think we can try to curtail some of these things and build rapport. So when they go out, they're familiar with people, they're going door to door and knocking with veteran officers and just learning how to engage with the community.
Thank you so much. Now there was, here's a question. Well, let me ask if Chief Singletary wants to also respond to that question.
I would agree with the majority of what the Deputy Commissioner said. I believe that there are roles for the unions to play. I think there are times where the unions do defend officers and management cannot act as quickly as the community wants us to act in that fashion, because discipline is so arduous within the organization. You know, discipline is negotiated with collective bargaining agreements, and the process for such is also as well. But I think we're hearing calls right now loud and clear as to some systemic changes that need to be made within law enforcement. And then many of the issues that we're talking about are systemic, are cultural, that didn't happen overnight. And certainly they're not going to change overnight, but I certainly believe that it starts with the management within the organization, who has to obviously set the tone, and also the environment within the organization. I have fired police officers, I've suspended police officers. I have worked with our district attorney to have charges dropped where I believe that an officer may have overstepped or the arrest was not appropriate. So I think you have to set the tone within the organization, and the expectations of your officers have to be known, have to be known throughout the organization. Are you going to have officers within the organization that do not abide by or don't want to rock with the tune? Absolutely you are. But I think it's important that supervisors in the organization, we hold them accountable. Sometimes it's not about what the officer did. It's also about, okay, supervisor, you're the next step. You sign off on the report. When did you know about it? What did you do about it when you knew about it? So it's holding that next layer accountable as well, if they knew about the action. Again, I believe that there are roles for unions to protect, officers who are from management who may be, overzealous or have a heavy hand. But at the same time, when discipline needs to be doled out, it needs to be doled out. But there is a process for such. As chief, I can kind of, go above and beyond the discipline, but I have to explain as to why, depending on how egregious the action occurred. But yeah, I mean, I think that there are some things that need to be changed within the organization. Again, police chiefs in the South say, I don't know how you are police chiefs up north with what you deal with regards to collective bargaining agreements and the like.
So let me ask a couple of related questions just on this topic, because among the areas that have been considered major, not sure what happened there. Am I coming across clearly now? I heard some reverb.
Yeah, you're okay, Professor. Someone else was already signed in, joined in from another line. So we get that.
Okay, all right. Sorry to have been thrown off by that. But so I want to ask this question because it has been a part of the discussion about what changes might be effective in some way in addressing some of these issues. And one of them is the matter of qualified immunity. And so qualified immunity relates to the fact that, when, say, an officer is found to have exceeded their authority or abused their authority, it's very difficult to charge them under criminal laws or under civil rights laws because they have been granted a great deal of immunity for any of their actions because they're doing that under the guise of law enforcement. So there's been a call to either abandon qualified immunity altogether or to further restrict it. And so I want to know what really any of the folks, because I think this affects, you know, any one of you in your respective positions, how you feel about qualified immunity. And then on a related note, because we've been talking about unions and their roles, and folks have described, say, disciplinary proceedings. And of course, you know, due process is important irrespective of where you are in the workplace. But many of those disciplinary proceedings or procedures that make it difficult to get bad officers out of the force have been part of the collective bargaining from unions. You could be aware of the example of the Camden, New Jersey Police Department, which completely dismantled their police department because they found that there was so much intransigence by the union in making the kinds of changes that they wanted to make, that they simply had to start from the ground up and rebuild their police department. And so I want to ask this, not only to the panelists that we have been talking to already, but I understand that there are some members of the community activist community out there, DeJohn Hall and Miles Gresham. I wonder if you all have any comments about how these changes to legally and also changes to actually rebuilding the police department to better suit the ways that communities want them to interact. Could I ask DeJohn or Miles to speak to us?
Yeah, sure. Hi, this is Miles Gresham. I am a lawyer at the Legal Aid Bureau and also a member of a community coalition called Free the People that has been working on criminal justice reform for the last several months, and then started really focusing on police reform in the last couple months. I guess in terms of dismantling the police department in order to just kind of circumvent the collective bargaining agreement, I don't know if we're there yet, but certainly what we've been told and what we've seen in the contract is that there are significant impediments to any kind of real disciplinary reform. I mean, just to give the example of the officer that called my friend the C word a couple weeks ago, he was suspended, and rightly so. And he was a white shirt, by the way. He was management, so this wasn't like a new police officer. This was someone who has worked for the police for a long time and has been promoted. But he'll be back. He'll be back because of the rules of the collective bargaining agreement that say that you can only keep someone suspended for so long without pay. And he'll be back and he'll be able to do the same thing again. And it was revealed when he got suspended this time that he had, thanks to the repeal of 50A, which just happened, it was revealed that he had a host of complaints against him. And this is in a police department where its internal affairs department, clears officers 94% of the time for wrongdoing. So you have an issue there with, the sort of police policing the police in terms of discipline, which is something that you would need to alter the collective bargaining agreement, I think, to change. There's the issue of, how do you discipline officers now, which, there are limits on which have to change. There's an officer who was involved in the death of a veteran at Molly's Pub several years ago. He's back on the force now, thanks to the collective bargaining agreement. You know, so, I mean, it just strikes me that if I, as an attorney, and I happen to be a fortunate attorney in that I'm in a union, right? If I, as an attorney, even in a union, called one of my clients the C word, or, you know, lied during an investigation into someone's death, I would be fired, no question. A bank teller would be fired, no question. You know, a cook would be fired, no question. Most of us on this call would be fired. And so eventually we have to kind of ask ourselves, well, why is it that, you know, police are able to get away with such egregious things and keep their jobs? And what we've been doing for the last several decades is just kind of saying the words collective bargaining agreement and throwing up our hands. We can't afford to do that anymore. There's like a whole culture of police that's, you know, goes from the top down, and it doesn't negate the exemplary officers that do exist, because there are some. But there's a culture in most police departments that is discriminatory against Black and brown people, that, you know, searches them disproportionately, that treats them with disproportionate force. It's legitimized by, you know, district attorneys' offices that, you know, go forward with a lot of frivolous charges that police officers make up often in our communities to justify the continued search and criminalization of our people. And so that has to change. And we can't just say, okay, well, collective bargaining agreement, let's all, like, you know, walk away and try to do something else. And so if it becomes necessary to dismantle the police department in order to get around this collective bargaining agreement, there's certainly, you know, an appetite for that among some of the community, but I think most of us would rather just work with the existing police department and change it. And I think that's possible as long as all sides come to the table in good faith. But if, you know, if they don't come to the table in good faith, then we have more of what we've already seen, which has kind of brought us here tonight, which is a lot of unacceptable things on behalf of the police that can't be changed because of backing from politicians, because of protection from collective bargaining agreements, et cetera. So.
Okay. Thank you for that, Miles. I think that Dejan Hall, if I understand correctly, I'm not sure if he's still here. If so, we'd love to hear from you. Are you here?
He did have to leave, Professor.
He did have to leave. Okay. You know, sorry we didn't get a chance to hear from him, but I'm sure that you all will hear more. Mr. Elmore wanted to comment further.
I just had a question for the two police chiefs, because they gave lengthy answers. But the question I have is, in your police departments, are police officers comfortable about telling on other police officers that do misconduct? What protections do they have if they do tell on police officers that are doing bad things or intervene?
I've had, you know, since I've been chief, I've had one or two instances where people have brought things to, you know, the administration's attention, and who have wanted to file, you know, formal complaints. But once things have brought to our attention, it's not like I can kind of ignore them anyway. So yes, I mean, I have had that. I can't speak for all 700 plus officers to say that they're comfortable with making complaints or filing complaints. But I can say that I've had a couple instances I've been chief where people have brought things forward to the organization. But again, I can't speak for all 700 plus individuals.
I mean, it would seem to me, if you've only had one or two, that's the answer. If only one or two out of 700 have reported misconduct, then it would seem to me that there's not a comfort level there.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, one can surmise that, I guess, if you want to surmise it that way. But again, I can't speak for all 700 plus. I think we have an internal affairs department that, you know, I have initiated investigations based on things that have been brought to my attention. So again, I mean, yeah, you can surmise it that way. Somebody else can surmise it another way. But
so I mean, if it's accepted that the police officers are not comfortable in telling on other police officers or intervening, what can be done to change that culture? And if this discussion could create a way to solve the change of that culture, we'd make a lot of progress for these next couple hours.
Well,
I mean,
again,
I don't think that that you can solve a problem without admitting that there's a problem.
I'm not denying that there isn't a problem. Again, I think it starts with me, it starts with management, it starts with the organization, myself. I can only speak for, since I've been sitting in this chair, the year and a couple months that I've been in this chair. And I think I have a good record. The Democrat and Chronicle recently just posted that my sustainment rate for professional standards cases is higher than my predecessor. I mean, you seem like you got something to, you want to contradict something that I'm saying.
Well, with all due respect, Chief, I mean, if you're saying that only 2 police officers have come to you out of 700 to report a problem, but then you're saying at the same time that police officers are comfortable reporting problems, I think, you know, change comes from the top. And so, I mean, I respect you and your thing, but I think that in order for the departments to change, the police chiefs has to say, okay, there's a problem. The men at the lower level are seeing things. They're not intervening. They're not telling on themselves. And I want to make sure that they're comfortable coming to me, that they're going to be protected. You know, I was chairperson of the Attorney Grievance Committee for the 4th Department for 4 years. I was in charge of disciplining lawyers and suspending lawyers in 8 counties, okay? Lawyers have to self-report conduct, okay? And if a lawyer sees another lawyer do conduct, they have to report it. And we have citizens' involvement with it. And that's why, you know, you don't see a lot of things where there's you know, lawyers are stealing money or lawyers are having sex with their clients because we have a duty to self-report. We have a culture that requires those to do so. And I think that if it would be similar in a police departments where somebody says, hey, I saw this guy smacking somebody around and it wasn't caught on videotape, because it seems to me when it's caught on videotape, yeah, there's a reaction, but when it's not caught on videotape, it just happens, and that's why we have these 1 or 2% that keep doing it over and over and over and over again, because those guys that are around them aren't comfortable in reporting it because of the blue wall of silence and the fact that they feel fear that they're not going to get the backup.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for not letting you off the hook.
And I'd like to make sure that we hear from Deputy Commissioner Lark on these matters as well. I mean, these questions affect both of these, you know, these officials.
Well, when Commissioner Lockwood was appointed as commissioner, I was shortly there promoted to deputy commissioner. We, all of the 2 deputies and myself and the commissioner, we went out to every district house, and we still have to do more. We have to repeatedly do this. To speak to officers on all shifts. We tried to cover it all and give, you know, we gave the speech. There's an open door policy, although I'm sure every officer is not going to say, yep, I have something to say, I want to go. There is a chain of command that you have to follow. But again, we did go out and we had honest, open conversations about what's happening in the police department and what's happening out in the communities. Again, like Mr. Elmore said, yes, it does start with management to set the tone on how we want to, what message we want to send throughout our police department. And we've done some of that. We certainly have a lot more work to do, certainly do. However, like I said, there are other ways. Officers might not go run and tell, you know, like there's a code out there on the street with the community. They don't want to be snitches. They don't help the police help solve crime that they clearly know who's responsible for. Well, sometimes officers might do that too, but as I said, they may find different ways of trying to deal with some things on their own. They show up on calls. They're there to watch and witness, and their cameras are on. So I'm a big proponent of the body cameras for many reasons. There are ways that officers do handle some things amongst themselves because they have to go to work and work with these other officers every single day, and they know and they learn how to deal with some things. That's not necessarily like I'm going to go run and tell on you, so to speak, but again, you can accomplish something in a lot of different ways by just your mere presence. And if that doesn't work, then they do say things. They do have conversations amongst themselves. They do self-police, and many times.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to make sure that Chief Singletary, I don't know if you had anything further to add to that conversation before we moved on to something else.
No, I would also just add that there are, you know, other means and mechanisms where people may feel comfortable coming to me directly. I've had that happen, but there's other means and mechanisms within the department for officers to file complaints as well.
Okay, so, all right, thank you. So I want to ask this question, and it's also come up from the audience, and that is about the body cameras that has been mentioned. And in some police departments, you all might know that it's discretionary for the officers as to whether or not they turn those cameras on. Is it discretionary or is it mandatory for the officers to have their cameras on once they have an interaction with the public in a law enforcement context?
For our agency, there's a body-worn camera manual, and it's not just discretionary. The officers have to turn it on when they're about to take some sort of law enforcement action, engaging the public, dealing with the public. So it's not discretionary, left up to the officer. In fact, when we do an audit based on field interview forms and traffic stops, with regard to taking a certain percentage to making sure that the officer did turn it on during that traffic stop. But it is not discretionary, it is mandatory in our agency.
Okay. And are you finding, what's the level of compliance that you're finding with that?
Well, the level of compliance is 96%. 96%. The other 4% could be due to a myriad of things, whether it can be knocked off. It could have been knocked off during a scuffle, or many times the camera may have misfunction. But we don't get that too often with regards to the malfunction of the camera. But a lot of times we're finding that it's based on a sample, it's a 96% rate that the officer has it on when he's supposed to have it on.
Mm-hmm. Deputy Commissioner? Oh, who was going to speak next?
Our department is mandatory as well when there's going to be interaction with the community, traffic stops, and so forth. It's mandatory that they use the body camera. If it's a very sensitive situation regarding like HIPAA or something like that in a hospital, there are certain instances where they can turn the body camera off, but we do have a policy and officers are mandated to follow the policy.
Okay, and what's your level of compliance?
Don't have the percentage at this point. Internal Affairs is monitoring that. I just don't have the numbers handy today. But when we do find violations, we are disciplining.
Okay. All right. I would like to go back to the question about Camden, because I want something to be clear, and that is the example of Camden was not solely, or I don't even think it was put in these terms, to circumvent the collective bargaining agreement, as opposed to a need to do something comprehensive in restructuring the police department. And so revisiting the role of the union and indeed the power of the union was part and parcel of that. But what it brings me to is also that comprehensive change had to do with, fundamentally revisiting the ways in which police officers were expected to interact with their communities and their attitudes toward the community. Not just as a force that was like a militarized force, but to be there as part of a positive component of the community in several ways. And so there was recalcitrance that was found in the police department for people who took a different view, that it wasn't a holistic view about the role of the police, but it was more about arrest than in terms of any other types of interactions with the community. And so the question that comes out of this for me has to do with, so much about the culture, acculturation, and what that means in terms of police training and existing police cultures. What is the role of education and training and the ways in which members of law enforcement, and I would add this to the district attorneys who are on the panel as well, so that the manner in which ADAs also have some knowledge, not just about the constitutional provisions, but also about the history of these United States, including its racial history, where we've been acknowledging that there are certainly a history of racism that has infected our institutions, including law enforcement. And I would extend that to the legal profession as well. So what is the educational imperative that has to happen to help to bring about some of these changes that we are saying are necessary to ensure that there is equal treatment and a different way of viewing policing and prosecution in our society and in our communities?
If I may jump in on that one, first of all, I think education and training, is certainly a very, very important component of all of this. We've started with some, bias and inclusion training in our office, and really, it's just the starting point. It's just kind of, where we can begin the discussion, because that training really was centered around, not even really appreciating, biases that exist that you don't necessarily acknowledge or even are self-aware of. And I think that's the start of it. I think the start is like what you said in the beginning of this conversation in total, is just the acknowledgement that there's systemic racism, period, and we need to move from that point on, acknowledging that reality. And then, having people personally, as far as my assistant DAs, appreciating that, if someone were to say, are you a racist? They're going to all say, oh my gosh, no, but just appreciating that there's biases that exist that aren't necessarily on a conscious level. So there's that component, but then there's also, I know Mr. Felder brought up, low-level crimes that happen with police departments, kind of like these nuisance crimes, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, obstructing governmental administration. And for our office, I've instructed, and it certainly happened when I started, saying, when you see those crimes being consistently charged, I want to know about it, because that is a training issue. Absolutely. That means there needs to be some intervention with that particular department. And it happened. I had an assistant DA come to me. She told me about a particular department that she started seeing, lots of those crimes, bad interactions with certain people in the community, including, people with mental health issues. And so she started collecting body cam video to show me these interactions. And that's what we brought to a police department to say, look, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing low-level crimes that really, if there was proper de-escalation training, there would be no charges here on any of these levels. So not only do we need to start dismissing some of these charges, but we also need to see why they're happening. So why are these, these road patrol officers having these interactions and feeling the need to charge someone with these interactions? So that's some of the things that we're starting to look at. So I do see from LaToya Lee, if you don't mind, there was a question, particularly
I see that as well.
in my office.
Yep.
And we have really, really struggled to get diversity in our office. And I think a lot of that has to do with Niagara County. I've gone to, the Students of Color organization at UB Law School saying, hey, we're not that far from Buffalo. Please consider our office. And right now I'm on an ad hoc committee about hiring for diversity in Niagara County. And I see it as a twofold problem in Niagara County, which will start a whole new discussion, but not to get off topic. But one of the problems in my office is getting attorneys to consider Niagara County. And part of that is because we have a residency requirement to live in Niagara County. So it's really, really hard to get people to consider moving here. What I've tried to do through our pastors is try to encourage, you know, young people in our community to consider, you know, internships here, to start considering it. But unfortunately, you know, I think there is an impediment because people move here and maybe the pay isn't as high as we've had other places. So I've really, really struggled to get applicants here. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that we're trying to address in Niagara County, which is kind of a problem across New York State for diversity in our workforce, is the civil service issue. So we've struggled with that, and that seems to be the focus of you know, current efforts here with our ad hoc committee, because the truth is I can't hire for very good paying jobs here in the office because I have to pick off the top 3, and if they're not there, you know, I have no ability to go beyond that. So those create a lot of challenges.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, excuse me, doing outreach to some of the, you know, the student of color organizations, you know, BALSA, LALSA, and other groups. So those exist in New York State, and I wonder, and I put this out there for everyone. You know, New York State is a, you know, fairly, you know, racial, multi-ethnic place, but there are others, and I wonder if you go beyond New York State to see if there is interest in some of these, you know, positions. You know, certainly, you know, here in Onondaga County, you know, there are different organizations of students as well as attorneys. And you might extend your outreach to these different communities. You know, there are national bar associations of African American folks and Latinx communities. And so, you know, that outreach can be, you know, very extensive so that, you know, people who would be interested in Niagara County or any other place, you know, would know about you and might entertain that thought.
Thank you.
Did anyone else want to comment on this, about the role of education training to begin to address some of these issues?
Can I jump in there? I'm sorry, this is Howard. I believe education and training is key. I know at one point in the Buffalo Police Department, and Deputy Commissioner Lark can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the officers had to have an associate's degree or 66 credit hours to maintain their role as officers. I think that has now been suspended. But I believe that the education and the training is key. Particularly the training, when you have training, you know, I have a private sector background, and we often had trainings every year. We had yearly annual trainings where we did cultural sensitivity training, bias trainings, and we had to do these trainings yearly. If you didn't, it probably could cost you your job. And I believe that, you know, that's some of the things that that can be implemented to help in this battle, because, you know, like was said earlier, if there are officers who are not familiar with the community or not familiar with that particular community they police, they don't have the understanding of the community that some folks will have. Particularly, I'm from the east side of Buffalo, and if I had to police in North Buffalo, I might not have the understanding of that community because I'm not from that community. I don't understand the little nuances, the little quirks that makes that community. And I think that, you know, I think some of the major issues is that some of the police that police on the east side of Buffalo, this is not knocking at Buffalo police, is that they don't understand the community that they police in. Even some of our own brothers and sisters who are doing the policing. So I think education and training is so key. I think that they should return back to the standards of that, you know, they have to have at least 66 credit hours to maintain their status as a police officer. And I think that, and and if I'm wrong, I'm hoping that the Deputy Commissioner can correct me, that they have those annual trainings that will help, and particularly with cultural issues that will help to turn that narrative around.
Thank you and welcome to the panel. Anyone else? Because I do have another question, but if anyone else wanted to weigh in on that.
I'd be happy to, just very briefly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, when it comes to training, the most important training that a police officer gets is when he leaves the academy. Everything that he really learns on the job and the practical applications of it come when they're in their probationary period, when they have a senior officer that they're assigned to. And so it is very important for the police departments, in my opinion, to be very selective when they have the senior officers that the probationary officer is riding with, and that they be trained and that they be monitored as well. Because when you work with that officer for your first 6 months, you're going to pick up his good habits, you're going to pick up his bad habits, and you want to make sure that those are officers that just don't tell them, okay, you know, forget about what you learned in the academy. This is how it is in the streets, and that they train those officers to use, the young ones to use the best practices and not the worst.
If I could just jump in really quickly on that question. I think that as other people have said, training is very important, and I think that you know, properly trained officers can serve everyone better. But I also think it's important to make sure that we make it easier to just fire bad officers or to fire racist cops. And I think that there's a danger that, you know, we kind of, this idea that you can get rid of racism through training is just kind of a fantasy, and it's a dangerous one that subjects, you know, Black communities to more racist policing while these trainings are failing. And so I think that while training is important for some officers, I think it also has to be made easier to fire the ones that are bad. And yeah, that's all.
Okay, I'm just looking at the time check for us now. We have a few more minutes remaining, and I want to make sure that, you know, any questions that we have remaining will have an opportunity to get addressed. And one of the issues that we're looking at is on this question of training, whether or not it's believed that that issues that racism or racist behavior can be quote unquote trained away. And on a related theme, the matter of you know, there's been a sort of, you know, catchphrase that's been used in recent times, and that is you've heard it, the call to defund the police, I imagine, and I'm wondering if your sense of what that means is literal, or if you believe that the call to defund the police means something more along the lines of reallocating resources that are devoted to law enforcement that might be spent in other areas, meeting other types of human and social needs. What is your sense of this, you know, the meaning of this call to defund the police?
If I can start, I believe the meaning to be is to reallocate resources. I don't think it totally means to defund. I don't think it totally means to abolish the police department, but to reallocate some resources, reallocate it to the communities that they're policing in. With health and human service issues and social service issues, that you could take those resources and do it with. That's my take on it.
And if it is to reallocate them how?
I think you have to reallocate them to services. I know there's a push now in the Buffalo area to add social service workers to the social service workers out there so that, you know, when you come across those non-violent crimes or those crimes where, you know, you don't necessarily have to have police, where you might need a social worker to come in or a mental health therapist to come in to jump in and take care of that. So reallocate resources into that area, go to those areas.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else have an impression on that?
I'm not sure how I feel about this whole defund situation. I think the first thing we need to do is actually, I think we need to have a community discussion. I think the communities that are affected by the police, because you have the concurrent problem of the violence in our areas. The city of Rochester, for example, we've had 70 shootings since the beginning of June. So you have a combination. Yeah, we have police misconduct, but we still have a crime problem. And so we have to have a discussion with the public to see what it is. Our section of the police and the resources that are allocated there, and if we want to reallocate, what do we allocate to? How far do we go? Because one of the problems is this, because of the way police departments were constructed, particularly in terms of diversity, and because of these contracts were last in, first out, if we start taking significant sums of money from the police and have to reduce the size of our police departments, what officers are going to be going first? And that's so you got to look. We got to look at this in a real. I'm not saying like we've cut here about. I think in the city they cut about $4 million. It's about 3.5% of the police budget here, and reallocated to other things. But when you really start talking about wholesale changes to allocations in the police department, you really have to look at what that looks like and how it's going to affect everything that's going on. Because the problems we have in our community are not going to disappear simply by defunding the police. And so there has to be a real discussion. And we got to get people to buy in it, because when they talk to particularly most of the elderly people I know and the homeowners I know in the city, they don't want to reallocate. They tell you don't defund the police. These are Black people. And so the activists are very big on it, you know. But you know, I want to make sure it moves beyond being a slogan and really put some meat on the bones and give people an idea what it's going to look like and how it's going to affect everything we got going on. You know, where the money in the police offices and the police departments is being allocated to, what departments, what areas, where's it going, and if you start defunding in a significant way, what the department is going to look like after you defund. And that's not only at the city level, but also at the countywide level. Because you have people in the city of Rochester saying they should take money from the Rochester Police Department and give it to social and give it to deal with issues that are really the province of the Monroe County Department of Social Services. So I don't think city taxpayers want their tax dollars going to, when they're already paying taxes to the county, want additional tax dollars coming from them going to the county to do what the county should be doing. We should be making sure the county is doing what they're supposed to be doing in those areas, not taking money from our departments to do things they should be doing. That's just an example.
Okay. So we are coming close to our time, and I want to make sure that some of the questions that we haven't gotten to will be addressed. So let me ask these questions so that we can get some responses to them. One is about the phenomenon of dollars for collars. That idea that as a matter of economics, that the more arrests that there are, then that brings in more revenue for the community, the police departments, and it raises the question of how questionable that practice is, and I wonder if anyone has a take on that practice.
If you don't mind. And I saw someone in the chat speak up about overtime in the police department. Yes. And that is something that we're trying to address. This is an issue. This is a significant issue. And I think police departments have to take a hard look at themselves and say, listen, even though certain overtime is allowed, we may have to address these issues to look at the practicalities. Otherwise, they're on a collision course with themselves, in my opinion. I'll give you an example of a practice that happens here that I've certainly heard about, and we've looked into it, or starting to look into it, is that a captain must get called on every felony. So even though they're not leaving their house and it's just simply a call through them for them to call somebody else instead of, calling the person who's on duty, who we know is going to respond to that felony, that person gets overtime. And to me, that practice is on a collision course with itself. We're talking, whether people want to call it defund the police or reallocating services, unfortunately, I think the defund police, that language has, kind of gets away from the really relevant discussion we need to have about the issues we're talking about reallocating, or at least bringing on social workers and so on to deal with some of the issues, or mental health professionals to help at a scene de-escalate a situation where it's somebody who's off their meds. They're not trying to commit a crime. They're in an unstable place in their life in that moment. But you will still need a police officer at the scene to keep the safety of everybody involved. So I think, unfortunately, the defund police thing has caught on and allows, certain groups to criticize and scare people into thinking, we're going to get rid of police departments and we're going to go and have no law enforcement. But I do think law enforcement has to take a hard look at their overtime practices, because there are some practicalities there that everybody does it because everybody else does it. And I've heard really good, hardworking police officers say, well, I do it because they do it, and I gotta send my kids to college too, and I gotta feed my kids. So, I do what everybody else does. And I think, until law enforcement takes a hard look at that, you're going to continue to have those abuses, and there are resources there that could be tapped to bring on other people to assist law enforcement on some of these very difficult and complex stops that happen.
Could I just say really quickly too, because you mentioned something that I had hoped we might have a chance to get into in earnest, and that is about mental health issues, that there is such a disproportionate impact with respect to folks who are known to have mental health concerns, and it can be a very sometimes lethal interaction when it comes to their issues and the police. And it goes back to the training discussion and your point of view about what police ought to be trained to do or to understand. And one of the words that really caught my attention was de-escalation. And so if there's training towards de-escalation as opposed to the escalation and assertion of power and authority, some of these situations certainly would turn out differently if there were greater understanding and training along these lines. So I want to thank you for raising that. One of the other questions that we didn't get to, and I want to make sure that we do, and that is a question about the Buffalo Housing Authority and whether or not those officers are required to have body cameras on as well. Can someone answer that for us?
I'll answer that, but I just want to say this regarding the de-escalation and the mental illness. The Buffalo Police Department has been working very diligently under the direction of our Captain Byer, who is our crisis intervention team coordinator. We are in the process of formulating a new team called the Behavioral Health Team that will work in conjunction with clinicians to go out on these calls to deal with mental illness. It's a diversion type program so that we don't have to make arrests. We can refer these people to resources on the spot and then do follow-up. We also have about 120 officers who have already received this crisis intervention training throughout the city, who currently are already responding to these types of calls. So, and I just have to say this, can't leave tonight without saying this, I am not a proponent for defunding the police for various reasons, and some have already been raised. Again, we have so much violence in the city of Buffalo that we absolutely have to address, and it is key that we keep all of our resources. We've already cut our police budget by a lot of money because of the budgetary issues in the city of Buffalo. We've already cut and can't afford to cut anymore. And to answer, and because I think we are already doing a great job with a ton of community policing efforts and initiatives, we got a lot of work to go, but we have been doing a lot of things that really haven't necessarily been publicized. Now I'll talk about Buffalo Housing. We no longer have the housing unit. The Buffalo Housing Unit was assembled, and those officers who worked in housing units have been transferred into districts. We have 5 districts, and we also have a traffic division. So depending on how much seniority they had an opportunity to select where they wanted to go. Housing complexes are being policed by the districts where the housing complexes are situated. Housing did not have body cams because they didn't have the capabilities of getting the body cameras in the office or the offices that they worked out of. So they weren't able to get body cams. Only for that reason, those officers have since received or are in the process of receiving body cam training so that the entire Buffalo Police Department will have body cams. So that's the answer for housing. Thank you.
Deputy Commissioner, I have one other question for you then, and that is, we were talking earlier about these, about the body cameras. What kind of accountability is there for officers who don't turn those cameras on or turn them on late in the process? How are they held accountable for their responsibilities with regard to these cameras?
We have had, again, I sat in on the file review that Internal Affairs brings before the commissioner and the 2 deputy commissioners. So have an opportunity to hear the disciplinary issues that are going on in the department. We have had some instances where officers weren't turning the body cameras on. We brought them up on disciplinary charges. We had a particular person suspended for not turning on the body cam. We constantly are training and we monitor the body cams constantly. If we're made aware of it, either through the DA's office or through our own monitoring of this, we are constantly sending word out to the districts, to the chiefs, for the chiefs to tell their captains, to the captains to tell the lieutenants, and to the POs, you must use your body cam. We've invested a lot of money in this body cam, and we feel that it's absolutely necessary for the community to have trust that we're going to do the right thing. And we are also trying to tell our officers that a lot of times allegations are made against them that are not true, and the body cam will show this, whether it's going to work against the officer or for the officer. The bottom line is that they have to use it. So they are being disciplined when they don't use it. Now, you have to keep in mind that, again, it's been around for a little bit of time, and they should know when to use it now, but you also have to take into consideration how quickly things happen. Things can go from 0 to, 20 in a matter of milliliters, seconds, and just very quickly. So if something is happening really quickly and they don't engage the body camera as quickly as they should, commissioner is going to take that into consideration on a case-by-case basis and then decide how he chooses to discipline on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. District Attorney Flynn, we haven't forgotten that you're with us. I have a question for you, and that is, we've been talking about trying to create solutions to improve situations that appear to be in need of solution. And so one of them is, whether or not in your capacity you would consider creating a complaints room at central booking in a way that would prevent overcharging by ADAs, that would allow the ADAs to speak frankly and privately with the police about the arrest, and perhaps a decision there could be made, that no prosecution is warranted, and it could perhaps address a number of these issues that we've been talking about. No need for officers at arraignment, and so forth. Would you consider that kind of proposal?
I don't know enough about it to tell you the truth. I know that New York City employs that. It's my understanding that they are the only entity in New York State that does that, as far as I'm aware of. So I don't know what that means as far as manpower changes. I don't know what that means as far as personnel changes, whether I got to hire more people. So to be honest with you, I really don't know what they actually do in New York City in that complaint room. So I don't have enough information about how that works to, quite frankly, answer that question.
Okay. But just from the rudimentary description that you have, it might be something that streamlines the process and in such a way that becomes not just economical, but also may mean that you don't bring people into the criminal justice system who could otherwise have alternative ways of addressing these issues. Is it an idea that you would entertain?
Again, it may. I would like to. I would like to see, quite frankly, and I'm a big proponent of the initiative that Deputy Commissioner Lark is talking about, where we engage in a crisis response unit or a lead unit, a law enforcement assisted diversion program, where we don't make the arrests and the arrests don't come in there in the first place. So I mean, I know more about that program. I know how that program has worked in Albany, and I know how that program has worked in other areas of the country. So I would, quite frankly, like to see that get up and running here in Buffalo, and see how that works. And then again, if there's still potentially an issue where there are too many matters that are being arrested in the first place, then yeah, I'm open to looking at anything.
Okay. So you all have been really generous with your time. You've been generous to me as your moderator. I thank you for that. We're going to wind up our discussion so that we finish at about 1/4 of the hour. Let me just say for myself that what I have heard this evening raises, many issues that I think you should continue to have the kind of conversations that we've been having this evening. There is much more that we didn't get to address, but in the time that we had, I think some very serious issues and possibilities have been raised. And as we started this conversation, we talked about where each of you in your respective positions saw yourselves as being responsible for addressing the concerns of race and racial disparities within law enforcement in your own bailiwicks. So I am hopeful that along with community members, community activists, and others throughout your different communities, that you'll continue to have these very earnest conversations to make the change that clearly people are desiring. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jamila and thank all of you again for participating.
Thank you, Professor Johnson, and thank you to all of our participants, especially our guest panelists who gave up 2 hours of their time after a long workday to be here. It is greatly appreciated. It shows your commitment in moving forward with reform in the criminal justice system. And just to reiterate, Anthony and I, and also Lanice, the president of the Syracuse Black Bar Association, we are committed to working together to continue these conversations. It's very healthy to have these type of conversations so we all can work together moving forward. And this is going to be part 1 of a series. We don't know what part 2 is yet, but based off of everything that we heard this evening, I think it may be necessary to even continue this conversation in a little more depth, because there were a lot more questions that people wanted to ask that we just didn't have the time to have our panelists answer. So, and moving forward, just to reiterate that the Minority Bar Association has teamed up with other outside organizations to work on a justice task force. We have all of our co-chairs present today. John Elmore, Attorney John Elmore, one of our panelists, Samantha White, our correspondent secretary on our e-board, and Miles Gresham, also a co-chair who is a staff attorney in the Legal Aid Bureau as well, who are heading this task force to basically keep this conversation going and to request reforms of our respective departments. And so they are working on creating bodies of work on an ongoing basis to submit to basically hold our respective branches accountable. And they are in the process of reaching out to other organizations who are doing the same work, so we can all work together. And there's no duplicative work. Sorry. I know UB Law Alumni Association is also involved. We have Dean Eileen Fleischman, who is participating in joint, and also importantly, the Bar Association of Erie County, who has agreed to help us in whatever way in a significant way in moving forward. So we thank you all for helping us in this initiative and just being committed to overall justice reform. We will be publishing more information about our next steps within the upcoming days. If you all have anything that you would like us to have as a conversation, please, as a conversation piece, please let us know. Again, the Rochester and Syracuse and Buffalo Bar Associations are working together, mainly because there's not many of us of the Black and Brown in the legal field, and we can work better together, and we could possibly get a lot more done to cover the upstate region. I just really want to say thank you again to Professor Johnson. We've had a few conversations, and I again will share the work that she is doing. So if anyone wants to join in and support that, we are living in the virtual world right now. So please look forward to learning about that information in our upcoming email blast. At this point, so please stay tuned for more of our conversation series, and we thank you all again. Anthony, if you would like to close out officially.
Jamila, thank you so much for that. And I must take the time to thank you for all of the hard work that you put in to make this happen. So of course, thank you. Thank your e-board as well as everyone else involved in Buffalo. I'd like to thank all of our participants, everyone from Rochester, everyone from Buffalo, and just remind that this is going to grow. Today we had a robust conversation. We had a lot of people involved today, and it's only going to grow, and it's only going to become better for us. I think that everyone should take from this that we have come to the table because we want to make change. And that is what we will do through this. We will find a way to make change. So thank you everyone for your time. I know we went a little bit over, but it was informative, it was educational, and it was collaborative. So thank you, and we will see you next time.
Have a good night.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks all.